November 1944. In a quiet POW camp deep in the American heartland, the day begins unlike any other. The German prisoners watch with suspicion. There's a strange energy in the air, a flurry of activity in the kitchens. The American guards are not on edge. They're almost festive. Rumors fly down the barracks. A special inspection. A new camp commandant? No one can guess the truth. In a few hours, the mess hall doors will open, and an act of psychological warfare will be waged not with bullets or bayonets, but with turkey and pumpkin pie. To understand the power of this moment, one must first understand the minds of these men. They were the survivors of brutal campaigns, plucked from the sands of North Africa or the hedgerows of Normandy. Their entire reality had been forged in the crucible of National Socialist ideology. They had been taught from their youth that the world was a place of merciless struggle. Their enemies, particularly the Americans, were depicted as a mongrel nation, decadent, weak, and culturally bankrupt, yet simultaneously cruel and gangster-like. Capture, they were assured, meant a gruesome end. The journey across the Atlantic in the holds of transport ships did little to dispel this fear. It was a long, dark passage from a world they understood to one they could only imagine through the distorted lens of propaganda. Yet when they arrived on American soil, the expected barbarism never materialized. Instead, they were met with something far more disorienting. Procedure. They were processed, given medical checkups, and sent by train to one of the hundreds of camps scattered across the United States. The journey itself was the first crack in their ideological armor. From the train windows, they saw a country not of poverty and decay, but of vast, unending prosperity. They saw towns with cars, farms overflowing with livestock, and a civilian population that seemed utterly untouched by the global cataclysm they had left behind. The camps themselves were a further shock. There were no torture chambers, no starvation rations. The facilities were Spartan, but clean and well-organized. They slept. Many prisoners initially believed it was an elaborate trick, a facade designed to lull them into a false sense of security before the inevitable cruelty began. They whispered to each other that it was all for show, for the benefit of the Red Cross inspectors. But the weeks turned into months, and the brutality never came. The guards were not the jack-booted thugs of their imagination. They were often older men, part of the National Guard, who regarded their duty with a kind of weary professionalism. They enforced the rules, but without malice. This slow, steady diet of decency was a more effective deprogramming tool than any lecture or pamphlet. It created a deep cognitive dissonance, a growing chasm between the world they had been told existed and the one they were now experiencing. It was against this backdrop of simmering confusion that Thanksgiving Day of 1944 dawned. The usual morning routine was subtly different. The guards were more relaxed, even friendly. The air carried an unfamiliar, tantalizing aroma. The scent of roasting meat and baking spices, a scent that belonged to a forgotten civilian life. For men accustomed to the thin soups and coarse bread of wartime Europe, and even the adequate but monotonous fare of the camp, this was an olfactory mystery. The suspicion in the barracks was palpable. Why the special treatment? Was it a holiday? They knew of Christmas, but this Thanksgiving was a foreign concept. As the time for the midday meal approached, they were marched to the mess hall, their minds racing with theories. They filed inside and froze. The world tilted on its axis. Before them was not the usual scene of men shuffling past a serving line with metal trays. The long wooden tables were covered in white paper cloths, And on those tables lay a feast of impossible proportions. There, arrayed in a spectacle of unbelievable abundance, were platters piled high with glistening, golden brown roasted turkey. There were mountains of creamy mashed potatoes, with deep wells of rich, dark gravy. Bowls overflowed with stuffing, vibrant cranberry sauce, and baskets were filled with soft rolls accompanied by pats of real butter, a luxury many hadn't seen in years. And at the end of the tables, waiting for them, were rows of pumpkin pies. For these German soldiers, this was more than just a meal. It was a scene from a fantasy. They had spent years subsisting on the meager, monotonous rations of a nation, deep in the throes of total war. They understood scarcity. They understood hunger. They did not understand this. This was not the food of a struggling nation. This was the casual, effortless abundance of a superpower so rich and so untouched by the war that it could afford to lavish a feast upon its enemies. The prisoners sat down slowly, hesitantly. They looked at the guards, then at each other, searching for a catch. There was none. The American guards, some of them smiling, motioned for them to eat. That first bite was a revelation. It was the taste of a different world, a world without blockades, without rationing books, without the gnawing anxiety of scarcity. But as the initial shock gave way to the simple, profound pleasure of a full stomach, a more complex and disturbing emotion began to surface: shame. They knew through letters from home and official reports how Allied prisoners were faring in German hands. They knew of the disease, the malnutrition, the brutal conditions. The stark contrast between that reality and the plate of food in front of them was a moral indictment. This act of generosity wasn't perceived as weakness, as their propaganda would have suggested. It was perceived as a display of immense, unassailable strength, not just industrial, but moral. The Americans weren't just feeding them. They were demonstrating a capacity for humanity that the prisoners' own regime had long since abandoned. This was the true battlefield. The conflict was no longer about territory or resources. It was about ideology, fought in the minds of these captive men. The Thanksgiving meal of 1944 was a weapon of soft power, more insidious and effective than a leaflet drop. It didn't demand surrender. It invited comparison. It didn't preach democracy. It demonstrated it through an act of decency. It systematically dismantled the caricature of the enemy and replaced it with a human face, a face that offered not a fist, but a plate of food. The long-term effects of this psychological victory were profound. In the years following the war, countless letters and memoirs from former German POWs would recount this specific experience. They wrote about how that one meal forced them to question everything they had fought and suffered for. It planted a seed of doubt that would grow into a wholesale rejection of the ideology that had led them to ruin. For many, it was the beginning of a new understanding of the world and of America. It laid the groundwork for post-war reconciliation, man to man, long before politicians signed treaties. Some of these former prisoners, their minds forever changed by an unexpected feast in a foreign land, would later choose to leave the ruins of their homeland behind. They would immigrate to the United States, drawn back to the nation that had defeated them not just with tanks and bombers, but with an astonishing, unforgettable act of Thanksgiving generosity.